Let's look at some critiques of a claim in Kanazawa about blonde hair. In case you need a refresher, Kanazawa's claim is that blonde hair turns darker with age, and it's thereby a signal of youth, and youth is a signal of fecundity. So thereby, if men instinctively find blondes more attractive, they're more likely to be mating with fertile women and thereby passing on their genes and the preference, right? Because our children tend to inherit you know not just our looks but our preferences too, right? That's why the preference has become widespread, according to Kanazawa. Here are some examples of critiques, and I do this exercise with students sometimes where I say, well, imagine you work for the school newspaper, and people send these critiques in for publication. Which ones would you publish? And we they vote on it. And this has happened enough times that there's pretty good data about which critiques the students find effective and ineffective. Let's look at them. Here's a critique that students have mixed feelings about. They generally describe as not that effective. They note that the gist seems to be, well, it's limited. And there is a quote here, but they don't find this argument as compelling as some of the other ones. Here's an argument that does get more votes from students. They think there's something kind of ironic about Kanazawa saying, well, oh, it's not the media, but he's basing that on a media study. This is one of the arguments that usually gets the most votes. They like how there's personal, kind of like some personal experience involved here on this writer's part, but there's a source to back it up. All right. Here's a critique that they tend to describe as humorous, but not necessarily that effective. One of the comments is that they're not really engaging with Kanazawa's argument so much as reacting to it. This critique usually gets the fewest votes of all, and they often students will say that the writer is bashing the messenger rather than the message. There's a lot of complaining about Kanazawa without so much trying to look at his claims. Here is a critique that gets votes and prompts a lot of discussion. They find this argument that maybe Kanazawa is looking at the relationship between blondes and having fun the wrong way. They find that compelling. Some people argue that this might be offensive to blondes. It could be, but for what it's worth, this is a critique that does attract some attention from students. Now, if you look at this over time, if people routinely seem to be picking the same letters as strong and the other ones as not as strong, it must suggest that there's some basic universal standards for what makes an effective critique and what does not. Let's take a look at some things that tend not to work. One thing we've seen is when you fail to engage with a source, right? It could just be because you misunderstand the source, or maybe you just don't want to really talk about it. And that's kind of what's going on here in D. They're getting at the message, but they're not really getting into the message. And here it's just purely about the author himself rather than what he said. Subjective responses tend not to work as well as something that's external. All right. It's one thing to say, well, that's not true for me, and it's another thing to say that and then back it up with a study that shows a lot of people feel that way too, right? Attacking conclusions rather than how the conclusions were reached. And this is something that's tricky, right? I mean, okay, you might see the conclusion as offensive, right? It might seem racist or sexist, okay? But that doesn't necessarily prove the study was bad, right? You need to go further. And I mean, there's this thing about what people should do and what they do. Like, we shouldn't treat people differently based on their hair color, right? We shouldn't do that. But what if we do? What if we actually do that? Then we shouldn't ignore that science. We should be open-minded about it and try to think about what's going on. And the other critique that I see sometimes, which I think is broadly speaking ineffective, is, oh, the study had limitations. All studies have limitations. You can't test them all, right? Here's what tends to work better. Questioning the evidence, right? Was it presented accurately, completely, honestly, or fairly? Maybe something's being left out. We can identify contradictions within the source. Now, an example of that is letter B, right? There's a contradiction here. He says it's not the media, but he cites a media study. That's a contradiction. There are external contradictions. Here's an example of an external contradiction. right? There's another source outside, an outside source that kind of says something different, right? That's an external contradiction. Uh, the other thing that works surprisingly well, you can use this so many times, is this whole correlation versus causation thing. If we say that things are correlated, we mean that they're related, but they don't necessarily cause each other. And authors oftentimes say that one thing causes another when it could just be that they're both just happening independently, or the causation relationship runs in the opposite direction. Let me give an example of what I'm talking about. If you go back to the 1950s, there was a lot of research into happiness, and the researchers would go around and they would survey people about their habits. How do you get to work? Do you ride your bike? Do you drive? What do you eat? Do you eat salads? Or, do you live in a big city or a small town? Do you have pets? How many pets? What kind of pets? And then they would just, are you happy? How happy? Finally, they would try to, look over all this data to look for connections. Like, well, gee, do people have pets say they're happier than the people who don't? And one thing that they routinely noticed was that the people who were married identified themselves as happier. And which led to this conclusion that marriage was an investment in happiness. You might not recognize this expression, but when I was younger, I heard this a lot. This was like a standard saying, and a lot of people just kind of took it as just conventional wisdom. Hey, you want to get happy in life? Get married. And then here's this bizarre poster, unveiledwife.com. I have no idea what that is, but they're kind of propagating that message there. And this went on for decades until a critic of that study looked at it and said, well, wait a minute. If you're grumpy, who the hell wants to marry you? Get it? Right? Because happy people are more likely to get married, right? Because that's the whole idea. So it's not that the marriage is causing happiness; the happiness is causing marriage, right? And so it's hard to see these things sometimes. But if you make this a habit, if you just try turning the causal relationship around, sometimes you'd be surprised. You'd be surprised how much you can find, and that's what's going on in this last letter, right? The idea is that, well, men like blondes, and so blondes have fun. But what if it's the other way around? What if blondes have fun? They like to, party or whatever, and that's why men like them.